He thought she was just a housewife. Then she cracked the equation no one could solve. What would you do if everyone in the world told you that you weren't smart enough, that your dreams were too big, that your place was at home and nowhere else? How would you feel if the one thing you were passionate about was the one thing everyone said you could never achieve? This is the extraordinary story of Eleanor Mitchell, a woman who was dismissed as just a housewife until she shocked the world by solving an equation that had stumped the greatest mathematical minds for decades. Eleanor's story begins on a crisp autumn morning at Cambridge University, where the prestigious International Mathematics Symposium was being held. The grand hall was filled with the world's most brilliant minds, men in tailored suits with prestigious titles and accolades behind their names. Among them stood Eleanor, a 30-year-old woman with graying hair pulled back in a simple bun, wearing a modest dress that she had carefully selected for this rare outing, away from her domestic duties. She wasn't supposed to be there at all. Eleanor had accompanied her husband, Professor William Mitchell, who was attending as a guest of his colleague. While the men discussed their important business, Eleanor had wandered into the main hall, drawn by a commotion surrounding a large whiteboard where dozens of mathematicians were gathered. "It's the Riemann conjecture," she overheard someone say. 10 years and no one's been able to crack it." Eleanor moved closer, her eyes scanning the complex equation that sprawled across the board. Something inside her stirred, a dormant passion that had been buried under years of making beds, cooking meals, and raising 3 children. Dr. Victor Harmon, a renowned mathematician with a sharp tongue and sharper ego, was holding court at the center of the group. His booming voice carried across the hall as he pointed to different parts of the equation. "The solution requires a kind of mathematical intuition that comes from years of rigorous academic training," he proclaimed. "This isn't something you can solve with basic algebra taught in some undergraduate course." Eleanor's eyes remained fixed on the equation, her mind already breaking it down, seeing patterns and possibilities that made her heart race. Without thinking, she stepped forward and said, "I think there might be an approach using modified Fourier transformations combined with elements of chaos theory." The room fell silent. Dozens of eyes turned to stare at her. Dr. Harmon looked at Eleanor as if noticing her for the first time. His gaze traveled from her sensible shoes to her unadorned face, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement. "And you are?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Eleanor Mitchell," she replied, her voice smaller than she intended. "Ah, Professor Mitchell's wife," Dr. Harmon said with a dismissive smile. "How charming of you to take an interest in your husband's field." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. "Perhaps while we work on this," Dr. Harmon continued, "you might be more comfortable in the reception area where they're serving tea. This is rather complex mathematics after all, not exactly household equations." More laughter. Eleanor felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. She wanted to explain that before she was Professor Mitchell's wife, she had been Eleanor Williams, the mathematics prodigy who had once been accepted to this very university. She wanted to tell them about the equations she solved in her head while folding laundry, the mathematical journals she devoured after everyone in the house had gone to sleep. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she nodded politely and backed away, the sting of humiliation burning in her chest. As she retreated to the reception area, she could hear Dr. Harmon's voice booming once again, now discussing the impossibility of solving the equation without extensive computational models. But something had awakened in Eleanor, a fire that had been smoldering for decades, now bursting into flame. She found a napkin on the reception table and with a borrowed pen began to scribble notes about the equation she had seen. The Riemann conjecture. Even the name sent a thrill through her. If she could solve it, but no, that was absurd. Who would believe that a housewife could solve what had stumped the greatest mathematical minds of the generation? But as she walked out of the symposium hall that day, a dangerous thought had taken root in her mind. What if she could prove them all wrong? What if she could solve the equation that none of them could? Eleanor clutched her napkin with the scribbled notes, unaware that she was about to embark on a journey that would change not only her life, but the very field of mathematics itself. As her husband drove them home, Eleanor stared out the window, the equation dancing behind her eyes. Nobody knew that beneath the facade of the perfect housewife beat the heart of a mathematical genius who was about to challenge everything they thought they knew about her. But what Eleanor didn't realize was just how much her pursuit of this mathematical holy grail would cost her, and how fiercely the academic world would fight to keep her in her place. What most people at that symposium didn't know was that 30 years earlier, Eleanor Williams had been considered one of the most promising mathematical minds of her generation. At just 17, she had won the National Young Mathematicians Award, solving complex calculus problems that stumped students twice her age. Her high school teachers had spoken of her in reverent tones, predicting she would one day join the ranks of history's greatest mathematicians. Eleanor had been accepted to Cambridge with a full scholarship, her heart set on pursuing a doctorate in applied mathematics. Her first year had been everything she'd dreamed of: challenging problems, stimulating discussions, and professors who recognized her exceptional talent. She had even published a paper on numerical solutions to partial differential equations, earning praise from the department head, who called her work remarkably insightful for an undergraduate. Then she met William Mitchell, a charismatic doctoral student who was immediately captivated by both her beauty and her brilliant mind. Their courtship was swift and intense. When William proposed at the end of her second year, Eleanor had accepted, believing she could have both marriage and her academic career. But the early 1980s had different plans for women like Eleanor. William's career took precedence, as was expected in those days. When he accepted a position at an American university, Eleanor put her studies on hold, assuring herself it would be temporary. Then came the children, first Thomas, then Rebecca, and finally little Sophie. With each child, Eleanor's dream of returning to mathematics receded further into the distance. "I'll go back when Sophie starts school," she would tell herself. But Sophie started school, and William's mother fell ill, requiring care. Then William was up for tenure, needing support at home during the stressful review process. There was always something, always someone who needed her more than she needed mathematics. Or so she told herself. In quiet moments, when the house was still, Eleanor would take out her old textbooks, working through complex problems, just to feel that rush of intellectual satisfaction again. She subscribed to mathematical journals, reading them late at night, keeping up with the field she had reluctantly abandoned. Her mind remained sharp, her passion undiminished, even as her opportunities dwindled. Now, as she sat at her kitchen table the morning after the symposium, the familiar sounds of domestic life surrounded her. The washing machine's hum, the ticking of the kitchen clock, the distant sound of neighborhood children playing. But Eleanor's mind was far away, consumed by the Reichmann conjecture. She had spread out several sheets of paper, transcribing the equation from memory, her hand trembling with excitement and trepidation. The Reichmann conjecture was notorious in mathematical circles for its elegant simplicity and stubborn resistance to solution. Proposed by German mathematician Klaus Reichmann in 1994, it connected concepts from number theory and quantum physics in a way that had profound implications for both fields. "What are you working on, dear?" William asked as he entered the kitchen, briefcase in hand, ready for another day at the university, where he was now a respected full professor. "Oh, just some puzzles," Eleanor replied, the automatic response of 30 years. She had long ago stopped sharing her mathematical pursuits with William. He had never explicitly discouraged her, but his dismissive smiles and quick changes of subject told her everything she needed to know. To him, mathematics was his domain, and her interest was merely a charming hobby, like knitting or watercolor painting. "Don't forget we have the department dinner tonight," William reminded her. "Dean Walters will be there with his wife." "I won't forget," Eleanor assured him, already calculating how many hours she could dedicate to the Reichman conjecture before she needed to prepare for the dinner. As William left for work, Eleanor returned to the equation with renewed focus. She knew the conventional approaches had failed. Everyone had tried to tackle it head-on, using established methodologies. But what if the solution required something different? What if it needed a fresh perspective, an outsider's view? For 3 days, Eleanor worked feverishly whenever she had a spare moment. She woke at dawn, worked until it was time to prepare. Breakfast, then returned to the equation after her household chores were complete. She took notes while cooking dinner, her mind constantly turning over variables and functions. On the 4th day, she had a breakthrough. A potential approach began to form in her mind, something that drew on an obscure theorem she had studied in her university days, combined with more recent developments she had read about in her journals. It was unorthodox, perhaps even radical, but it might work. Excitement coursed through her as she reached for the phone. Without thinking, she dialed the mathematics department at Cambridge and asked to speak with Dr. Harmon. His secretary put her through, probably assuming she was calling on William's behalf. "Dr. Harmon speaking," came the crisp, authoritative voice. "Dr. Harmon, this is Eleanor Mitchell. We met at the symposium last week. I believe I may have found an approach to the Reichman conjecture that hasn't been explored yet." There was a pause, followed by a chuckle. "Mrs. Mitchell, isn't it? Professor Mitchell's wife?" "Yes, but how delightful of you to call. I didn't realize you had such an active interest in mathematics." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I've been examining the equation, and I believe a combination of topological analysis and modified tensor calculus might provide a pathway to—" "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Harmon interrupted, his voice now carrying a hint of impatience. "The Reichman conjecture has been studied by teams of mathematicians with decades of experience and advanced degrees. It's not something one solves over afternoon tea." Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. "I understand that, but I have a strong background in—" "I'm sure you're very bright," Dr. Harmon said condescendingly, "but there's a vast difference between solving the Sunday crossword and tackling one of the most complex mathematical problems of our time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a lecture to prepare." The line went dead. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, the phone still pressed to her ear, humiliation and anger coursing through her in equal measure. She slowly replaced the receiver, her hand trembling. That evening, at the department dinner, Eleanor found herself seated next to Dean Walters' wife, a pleasant woman who spent the entire meal discussing her garden club and grandchildren. Across the table, she could see William engaged in animated conversation with Dr. Victor Harmon, who had apparently been invited as a guest lecturer. "Your husband tells me you have an interest in mathematics," Dr. Harmon said suddenly, addressing Eleanor across the table with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "He mentioned you called my office today." The table fell silent. William looked at Eleanor in surprise. "Yes," Eleanor replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I wanted to discuss the Reichman conjecture." Dr. Harmon's smile widened. "Mrs. Mitchell believes she might solve it," he announced to the table, prompting a ripple of amused smiles. "Perhaps between preparing dinner and doing the laundry, she'll succeed where the Cambridge mathematics department has failed." The laughter that followed burned into Eleanor's soul. Even William joined in, though his eyes held a hint of confusion and concern. Only Dean Walters' wife looked uncomfortable, patting Eleanor's hand in what was meant to be sympathy, but felt like pity. "Well, good luck to you," Dr. Harmon said, raising his wineglass in a mock toast. The Able Foundation is offering $1 million prize for the solution. You could buy quite a few new kitchen appliances with that. More laughter. Eleanor forced a smile, playing the role of the good-natured faculty wife who could take a joke at her expense. Inside, something hardened. She would solve the Reichmann conjecture, and when she did, she would make sure Victor Harmon was the first to know. As the evening wore on, Eleanor retreated into herself, smiling and nodding at appropriate intervals, while her mind continued to work on the equation. What she didn't realize was that this dinner was just the beginning of her humiliation. The story of the professor's wife, who thought she could solve the unsolvable, was too amusing not to share. And by the end of the week, Eleanor had become something of a departmental joke. But while the academic world laughed, Eleanor was about to embark on the most challenging work of her life, driven by a determination that would soon silence every mocking voice. Little did they know that the woman they dismissed as just a housewife was already seeing patterns in the Reichmann conjecture that had eluded them all for years. The story of Eleanor's mathematical ambitions spread through academic circles like wildfire. What began as a joke at a dinner party evolved into an anecdote professors shared during coffee breaks, a punchline that reliably earned chuckles at faculty meetings. Dr. Harmon, in particular, seemed to relish telling the tale, embellishing it with each retelling until Eleanor had been transformed into a caricature, the delusional housewife who thought she could outsmart the world's greatest mathematicians. 2 weeks after the dinner party, Eleanor attended a university function with William, only to walk into a room that fell awkwardly silent at her entrance, followed by poorly concealed smirks and whispers. One young professor's wife approached her with exaggerated interest. "Is it true you're working on that famous equation? How fascinating. I can barely help my children with their homework," she said, her voice carrying a hint of mockery that made Eleanor's stomach clench. "The Reichmann conjecture, yes," Eleanor replied calmly, though her heart was pounding. "It's an interesting problem." "Well, we're all rooting for you," the woman said with a wink to her companions. "Girl power and all that." Eleanor smiled tightly and excused herself. In the ladies' room, she gripped the edges of the sink, staring at her reflection. When had she become this person? This subject of ridicule, this woman who was neither respected as a mathematician nor fully comfortable in her role as a faculty wife. She splashed cold water on her face and straightened her shoulders. The mockery hurt, but it would not deter her. At home, things were becoming increasingly tense. William, embarrassed by the gossip surrounding his wife, had initially tried to laugh it off, but as the jokes persisted, his embarrassment turned to frustration. "Couldn't you just drop this, Eleanor?" he asked one evening after another uncomfortable department gathering. "Take up gardening or book club like the other wives. This obsession with the Reichmann thing is making us both look foolish." "It's not an obsession, William," Eleanor said quietly. "And it's not just the Reichmann thing. It's mathematics. It's what I love, what I've always loved." William ran a hand through his graying hair. "That was a long time ago, Eleanor. We all have dreams when we're young, but at some point we have to accept reality." The words stung more than any mockery. From strangers, William had once loved her mind as much as her heart. When had he stopped seeing her as a mathematician? When had he started seeing her as just a housewife? Even her children, now adults with lives of their own, expressed concern when they heard about their mother's new hobby. "Mom, are you sure you're okay?" Rebecca asked during their weekly phone call. "Dad says you're barely sleeping, that you're covering the kitchen table with papers and books." "I'm fine, sweetheart," Eleanor assured her. "I'm just challenging myself." "Dad says people are laughing at you," Rebecca said hesitantly. "He's worried about you. We all are." Eleanor closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "Your father is exaggerating. I'm perfectly fine." But she wasn't fine. The mockery from the academic community, the lack of support from her family, and the increasing isolation were taking their toll. Eleanor had always been the one who supported others, who put her own needs last. Now that she was finally pursuing her passion, she found herself standing alone. The lowest point came a month into her work on the Reichmann conjecture. William had left for a conference, and Eleanor, free from the need to prepare meals or maintain appearances, had worked through the night on a particularly promising approach. Dawn found her surrounded by crumpled papers, her hair disheveled, eyes red from lack of sleep. The phone rang, startling her from her calculations. It was Thomas, her oldest son. "Mom, Dad called me. He's worried sick about you. He says you're not eating, not sleeping, that you're obsessed with some impossible math problem." Eleanor rubbed her tired eyes. "It's not impossible, Thomas. Difficult, yes, but not impossible." "Mom." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm, the same tone she had used with him when he was a stubborn child. "You have a liberal arts degree that you never finished. You haven't worked in mathematics in 30 years. Don't you think it's a bit unrealistic to think you can solve a problem that professional mathematicians can't?" Eleanor felt as if she'd been slapped. "I was top of my class at Cambridge," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That was a different time, Mom. Mathematics has advanced. It's not the same field anymore." "I've kept up with the advances," Eleanor said defensively. Thomas sighed. "By reading journals at the kitchen table? Mom, be realistic. Rebecca and I have been talking. We think maybe you should see someone, a therapist. This isn't like you, this fixation." Eleanor's hand tightened on the phone. Her own children thought she was having some sort of breakdown. They couldn't imagine that their mother, the woman who had baked their birthday cakes and hemmed their school uniforms, could also be a mathematician capable of original thought. "I'm not having a breakdown, Thomas," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I'm doing mathematics. I'm sorry if that doesn't fit with your image of me." After hanging up, Eleanor sat at her paper-strewn table, a profound sense of loneliness washing over her. For the first time, she questioned herself. Was she being delusional? Was it ridiculous for a housewife in her 50s, decades removed from formal education, to think she could solve what renowned mathematicians could not? She gathered her papers, staring at the equations that had consumed her life for the past month. Perhaps everyone was right. Perhaps she was just making a fool of herself, chasing an impossible dream because she couldn't accept the life she had chosen. With a heavy heart, Eleanor collected all her work on the Reichmann conjecture and placed it in a box, which she then stored in the back of her closet. That evening, she cleaned the house thoroughly, removing all traces of her mathematical pursuits. When William returned from his conference 2 days later, he found the home in perfect order and his wife preparing his favorite meal, as she had done for 30 years. "You're looking better," he commented, kissing her cheek. "I'm glad you've put all that nonsense behind you." Eleanor smiled and nodded, ignoring the hollow feeling in her chest. For 3 days, she played the role perfectly. The devoted faculty wife, the efficient homemaker, the supportive spouse. She attended a garden club meeting with Dean Walters' wife, discussed recipes and grandchildren, and pretended not to notice the relieved glances William cast her way. But on the 4th night, unable to sleep, Eleanor found herself standing before her closet. The box of papers called to her, like a siren song she couldn't resist. With trembling hands, she retrieved it and carried it to the kitchen table. As she spread out her work once more, a strange calm settled over her. Everyone she loved might think she was foolish or delusional, but in this moment, with these equations, she was more herself than she had been in 30 years. "I don't care if they laugh," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "I don't care if I fail, but I will not spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been." With renewed determination, Eleanor returned to the Reichmann conjecture. This time, She would work in secret, carving out time when William was at the university, hiding her papers when she heard his car in the driveway. She would be Eleanor, the housewife, to the world. But in these stolen hours, she would be Eleanor, the mathematician once more. What she didn't know as she bent over her calculations that night was that her darkest moment had passed, and that hidden in those pages was not just a mathematical breakthrough, but a chance for Eleanor Mitchell to reclaim her identity and silence every voice that had ever told her she was just a housewife. And somewhere in the equation that had defeated the greatest minds of a generation, Eleanor was about to find something no one else had seen. Eleanor's breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 2 months into her secret work on the Reichmann conjecture. She had been staring at the same set of equations for hours, her mind wandering in that peculiar, half-focused state that sometimes leads to unexpected connections. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, creating a soothing rhythm that matched the flow of her thoughts. She was thinking about the laundry of all things, specifically about folding fitted sheets, a task she had perfected over decades of homemaking. The way the elastic corners needed to be tucked into each other, transforming an awkward, bulky shape into something neat and symmetrical. Something about that image triggered a connection in her mind. What if the Reichmann conjecture could be approached similarly, not by tackling it head-on, but by folding its components in on themselves in a specific pattern? Eleanor's hand moved almost of its own accord, sketching a new diagram beside her previous work. Instead of treating the equation as a linear problem, to be solved step by step, what if she envisioned it as a multi-dimensional structure that could be collapsed into a simpler form? Her heart began to race as the implications unfolded before her. It was an unconventional approach, drawing on topology and dimensional analysis in a way that seemed almost intuitive rather than rigorously mathematical. But as she worked through the initial calculations, the numbers aligned with a harmony that sent chills down her spine. This could work, she whispered to herself, disbelief and excitement warring in her voice. This could actually work. For the next 3 days, Eleanor barely slept, refining her approach, checking and double-checking her work. She was careful to maintain her domestic routines when William was home, cooking dinner, discussing his day, watching television beside him in the evening. But the moment he left for the university, she returned to her calculations with feverish intensity. By Friday, she had confirmed her initial breakthrough. She hadn't solved the conjecture yet, but she had found a pathway that no one else had explored, an approach that reduced the complexity of the problem significantly. It was as if she had discovered a secret door in a maze that everyone else had been circling for years. Eleanor knew she needed validation, someone with mathematical expertise to confirm that her approach was sound. But who could she trust? The academic community had already dismissed her as a dilettante, and William had made it clear he considered her pursuit foolish. With trembling hands, she dialed a number she had found in an old address book. Professor Emilia Cortez, a former classmate from her Cambridge days who now taught at Oxford. They hadn't spoken in nearly 3 decades. Emilia, it's Eleanor Williams. Well, Mitchell now. From Cambridge? Yes, it has been a long time. After awkward pleasantries and brief catch-ups, Eleanor took a deep breath and explained her situation, half expecting to be met with the same condescension she had received from Dr. Harmon. Instead, there was a thoughtful silence on the other end of the line. "Send me what you have," Emilia said finally. "I can't promise anything, but I'll look at it." The next day, Eleanor packaged her work carefully and sent it by express mail to Oxford. Then came the waiting. 3 days of anxious checks for phone messages, jumping each time the phone rang. William noticed her nervousness, but attributed it to the upcoming faculty gala. where Eleanor would once again face the colleagues who had mocked her mathematical ambitions. When Amelia finally called, Eleanor was folding laundry, the very task that had inspired her breakthrough. She nearly knocked over the laundry basket in her rush to answer the phone. "Eleanor," Amelia's voice was measured, professional. "I've reviewed your work on the Reichmann conjecture." Eleanor's heart sank at the formal tone. And I think you might be onto something significant." The fitted sheet in Eleanor's hand slipped to the floor. "You do? Your approach is unorthodox, but it's elegant. You've made connections that I've never seen before. The dimensional folding concept is particularly inspired." Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes. For the first time in months, someone was taking her seriously as a mathematician, not humoring her, not patronizing her, but recognizing the merit in her work. "It's not a complete solution," Amelia continued. "There are gaps that need to be filled, rigorous proofs that need to be developed. But the foundation is solid, Eleanor. Remarkably solid." Eleanor sank into a chair, weak with relief and validation. "Thank you," she managed. "You don't know what that means to me." "Actually, I think I do," Amelia replied, her tone softening. "I remember you from Cambridge, Eleanor. You were brilliant. Many of us wondered what happened to you. What happened to me, Eleanor thought. Marriage, children, life, the traditional path that had been expected of women of her generation. She had never regretted her children, but in this moment, she allowed herself to wonder about the mathematical career she might have had. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," Amelia said, interrupting Eleanor's thoughts. "Dr. Naomi Chen. She's a visiting professor from MIT, specializing in areas related to the Reichmann conjecture. Would you be open to sharing your work with her?" "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Yes, please." The meeting with Dr. Chen was arranged for the following week at a small cafe halfway between Oxford and Cambridge. Eleanor told William she was meeting an old school friend, a small deception that filled her with guilt but seemed necessary given his opposition to her mathematical pursuits. Dr. Chen was younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with keen eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She had already reviewed Eleanor's work, courtesy of Amelia, and wasted no time on pleasantries. "Your dimensional folding approach is fascinating," she said, spreading Eleanor's papers on the cafe table. "It reminds me of work being done in quantum topology, but applied in a way I haven't seen before." For the next 2 hours, they discussed the Reichmann conjecture in detail, with Dr. Chen pointing out areas that needed further development and Eleanor explaining her intuitive leaps. It was the most intellectually stimulating conversation Eleanor had experienced in decades, a reminder of the academic world she had left behind. "You know," Dr. Chen said, studying Eleanor over the rim of her coffee cup, "there's a small conference on emerging approaches to unsolved problems in mathematics next month. Very informal, just 20 or so researchers. I think your work would be of great interest." Eleanor's immediate instinct was to decline. The thought of presenting her unfinished work to a room of professional mathematicians terrified her, but Dr. Chen seemed to read her mind. "These are people who value innovative thinking," she assured Eleanor, "not the old guard who can't see. Past their own methodologies. Will you at least consider it?" Eleanor promised to think about it, and on the drive home, her mind raced with possibilities. The validation from Amelia and Dr. Chen had given her a new confidence. Her approach wasn't just a housewife's hobby, it was mathematically sound, potentially groundbreaking. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine actually solving the Reichmann conjecture, of standing before the mathematical community, not as an object of ridicule, but as a respected peer. When she arrived home, she was surprised to find William waiting for her, his expression troubled. "Dr. Harmon called," he said, without preamble. "He saw you meeting with Naomi Chen today." Eleanor froze. "You know Dr. Chen?" "Everyone knows Naomi Chen. She's one of the leading experts on the Reichmann conjecture. William's voice was tight with controlled anger. "He said you were showing her papers, that you're still working on this obsession." Eleanor's newfound confidence wavered, but didn't break. "It's not an obsession, William. It's mathematics, and Dr. Chen believes my approach has merit." William ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Eleanor, do you have any idea how this makes me look? My wife sneaking around, becoming the laughingstock of the department? Is that what concerns you?" Eleanor asked quietly. "How it makes you look?" The question hung between them, exposing a truth neither had acknowledged. William's silence was answer enough. "Dr. Chen has invited me to present my work at a conference next month," Eleanor said, straightening her shoulders. "I'm going to accept." She expected an argument, perhaps even an ultimatum. Instead, William looked at her with something like sadness. "You've changed," he said finally. "I don't recognize you anymore." As he left the room, Eleanor reflected on his words. Perhaps she had changed, or perhaps she was finally returning to the woman she had been before she became Mrs. William Mitchell. Either way, there was no turning back now. The following week, Eleanor worked with renewed vigor, incorporating Dr. Chen's suggestions and refining her approach. She communicated regularly with both Dr. Chen and Amelia, who had become not just supporters, but collaborators, offering insights that helped Eleanor navigate the more technical aspects of her proof. Word was beginning to spread in certain mathematical circles about the unorthodox approach being developed by an independent researcher. Dr. Chen had tactfully omitted mentioning that this researcher was a housewife with no formal credentials. Small groups of graduate students and young professors were starting to discuss Eleanor's dimensional folding concept, not yet knowing its origin, but intrigued by its potential. And then, 3 weeks before the conference, as Eleanor was working late into the night, the final piece fell into place. She had been struggling with a particularly stubborn element of the proof, a section where her intuitive approach needed rigorous mathematical underpinning. Drawing on a combination of chaos theory and an obscure theorem she had studied in her Cambridge days, Eleanor found the connection that completed her approach. Her hands trembling, she worked through the final calculations, checking and rechecking her work. As the first light of dawn filtered through the kitchen windows, Eleanor sat back in her chair, exhausted but exhilarated. The Reichmann conjecture. She had solved it. She reached for the phone to call Amelia, then hesitated, looking at the clock. It was barely 5 a.m. Instead, she carefully organized her papers, placing them in a folder that she labeled simply Reichmann Solution. Then for the first time in months, Eleanor Mitchell went to bed with a sense of complete peace, unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The day of the conference arrived with a crystalline autumn clarity that seemed fitting for the momentous occasion. Eleanor had spent the past 3 weeks refining her presentation with Dr. Chen's guidance, preparing to introduce her solution to the Reichmann conjecture to a select group of mathematicians. The small conference was being held at a historic college in Oxford, in a wood-paneled room where centuries of scholarly debate had unfolded. Eleanor dressed with careful deliberation that morning, selecting a navy blue dress that was modest yet professional, adding the pearl necklace William had given her on their 25th anniversary. She wanted to look the part of a serious mathematician, not the housewife that the academic world had dismissed. William had barely spoken to her in the weeks leading up to the conference. He had retreated into cold civility, treating her as if she were a guest in their home rather than his wife of 30 years. That morning, as she prepared to leave, he had simply nodded and returned to his newspaper. "I'll be back tomorrow," Eleanor said, standing in the doorway with her overnight bag and the precious folder containing her solution. William looked up briefly. "Good luck," he said, his tone making it clear he believed she would need it. The journey to Oxford gave Eleanor time to rehearse her presentation and calm her nerves. By the time she arrived at the college and was greeted by an enthusiastic Dr. Chen, she felt a strange sense of homecoming, as if she were returning to the academic world she had left behind decades ago. There have been some changes to the program, Dr. Chen informed her as they walked through the ancient quadrangles. Your presentation has been moved to the main session. There's been quite a bit of interest in your approach. Eleanor's steps faltered. The main session, but I thought this was going to be a small group. Word has spread, Dr. Chen admitted. Your dimensional folding concept has created something of a buzz, and, she hesitated, Dr. Harmon has decided to attend. Eleanor's heart sank. Victor Harmon, the man who had publicly humiliated her, who had dismissed her as a mathematical dilettante playing at solving problems beyond her comprehension. He heard about an innovative approach to the Reichmann conjecture being presented today, Dr. Chen explained. He doesn't know it's you. Part of Eleanor wanted to flee, to return, to the safety of her kitchen where no one mocked her or questioned her abilities. But a stronger part, the part that had stubbornly worked on the conjecture despite all opposition, straightened her shoulders. Let him come, she said with newfound resolve. Let them all come. The conference room was larger than Eleanor had expected, with rows of seats already filling with mathematicians from various universities. She recognized a few faces from academic journals, respected figures in the field who had no idea that the E. Mitchell scheduled to present was a housewife from Cambridge with no formal credentials. And there, in the third row, sat Dr. Victor Harmon, leafing through the conference program with an expression of mild interest. He glanced up as Dr. Chen escorted Eleanor to the front row, his eyes passing over her without recognition before returning to his papers. The session chair, a distinguished professor from Edinburgh, opened the proceedings with an overview of the day's presentations, saving Eleanor's for last. And finally, we have what promises to be an intriguing new approach to the Reichmann conjecture, presented by E. Mitchell, an independent researcher who has been collaborating with Dr. Naomi Chen of MIT. As three other presenters shared their work, Eleanor sat quietly in the front row, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. She reviewed her notes one last time, though she hardly needed them. Every step of her solution was etched in her mind after months of intensive work. Finally, the session chair announced, "Our last presenter today is E. Mitchell with a dimensional folding approach to the Reichmann conjecture. Professor Mitchell, the floor is yours." A murmur ran through the audience as Eleanor rose and made her way to the podium. She heard Dr. Harmon's voice, louder than necessary, asking a colleague, "Mitchell? Any relation to William Mitchell?" Eleanor placed her papers on the podium and looked out at the sea of faces, curious, skeptical, a few openly dismissive as they realized who she was. Dr. Harmon's expression had transformed from mild interest to barely concealed amusement. "Good afternoon," Eleanor began, her voice steadier than she had expected. "I am Eleanor Mitchell. Some of you may know me as Professor William Mitchell's wife. Today, however, I am here as a mathematician." She could see the surprise rippling through the audience, the exchanged glances, the raised eyebrows. Dr. Harmon leaned over to whisper something to his neighbor, both of them smirking. Eleanor took a deep breath and continued. "The Reichmann conjecture has resisted conventional approaches for nearly 3 decades. Today, I present not just a new approach, but a complete solution." The whispers grew louder. Claiming to have solved one of mathematics' most stubborn problems was bold, especially coming from someone with no formal position in academia. Dr. Harmon's smirk widened into a barely suppressed laugh. But Eleanor had prepared for this moment. Without further preamble, she launched into her presentation, starting with the foundational insight, her dimensional folding concept, inspired by something as mundane as folding fitted sheets. As she spoke, she grew more confident, the mathematics flowing through her as naturally as breathing. She moved methodically through her approach, explaining each step with clarity and precision. The whiteboard behind her filled with elegant equations and innovative diagrams. 20 minutes into her presentation, the whispers had ceased. The room was utterly silent, except for the sound of her voice and the scratch of her marker on the board. Eleanor was so focused on her explanation that she didn't immediately notice the change in the atmosphere. When she paused to take a sip of water, she looked out at the audience and saw that the smirks and skeptical expressions had vanished. In their place was rapt attention, furrowed brows of concentration, and in some cases dawning amazement. Even Dr. Harmon was leaning forward, his eyes fixed on her equations, his expression a mixture of disbelief and reluctant interest. The key insight, Eleanor continued, is that by reconceptualizing the Reichmann variables as a multidimensional manifold that can be collapsed along these specific vectors, we can reduce the problem to a form that becomes solvable using modified tensor calculus. She wrote the final equation on the board, the culmination of months of work, the solution that had eluded the mathematical community for decades. And thus, she concluded quietly, the Reichmann conjecture is proven. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then the room erupted in a chaos of voices, questions, exclamations, furious note-taking. In the third row, Dr. Harmon sat motionless, staring at the equation as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The session chair had to call repeatedly for order. When the room finally quieted, he said, "We'll take questions now for For Dr. Mitchell," Eleanor corrected him gently. "Just Ms. Mitchell is fine. I never completed my doctorate." A young woman in the back row stood up. "Your approach is revolutionary. Have you considered its applications to quantum field theory?" Eleanor smiled. "Yes, actually. The dimensional folding concept has potentially broad applications beyond the Reichmann conjecture." Another mathematician rose. "The tensor mapping. In step 4, that's unlike anything I've seen in the literature. How did you develop it?" As Eleanor answered questions with growing confidence, she noticed that Dr. Harmon remained silent, his expression unreadable. Finally, as the session was drawing to a close, he raised his hand. The room hushed. Everyone there knew of Dr. Harmon's previous dismissal of Eleanor's mathematical abilities. The story had spread through academic gossip channels. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "your solution is unexpected. Particularly, your approach in the third segment, using concepts from chaos theory. I find myself wondering why no one has explored this direction before." It wasn't quite a question, but Eleanor understood what he was really asking. "How did you, a housewife, see something that I couldn't?" "Perhaps," she replied evenly, looking directly at him, "because sometimes the most valuable insights come from outside conventional thinking. Sometimes, Dr. Harmon, the person you least expect to have the answer is precisely the one who does." A ripple of appreciative murmurs spread through the room. Dr. Harmon's face flushed, but he inclined his head slightly, the closest thing to acknowledgement she was likely to get. As the session concluded, Eleanor was surrounded by mathematicians eager to discuss her work further. Business cards were pressed into her hands, invitations extended to speak at other conferences, questions asked about potential papers she might be working on. Dr. Chen appeared at her side, beaming with pride. "I told you they'd be interested," she said. "But I didn't expect quite this level of excitement." Eleanor caught sight of Dr. Harmon making his way toward her through the crowd. When he reached her, he cleared his throat awkwardly. Ms. Mitchell, he said formally, your solution is remarkable, truly innovative. I find myself needing to reevaluate certain assumptions. It wasn't an apology, but coming from Victor Harmon, it was extraordinary. Thank you, Dr. Harmon, Eleanor replied simply. He hesitated, then added, the Able Foundation will need to verify your proof, of course, but if it holds, and I believe it will, the prize is rightfully yours. The Able Prize, $1 million in recognition as one of the world's preeminent mathematicians. The prize he had mockingly referenced at that humiliating dinner party. I look forward to their review, Eleanor said calmly, though her heart was racing. As Dr. Harmon walked away, Eleanor turned to find Emilia Cortez standing nearby, tears in her eyes. I always knew you were brilliant, Emilia said, embracing her old friend. Always. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her hotel room, too exhilarated to sleep. Her phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from her children, who had heard the news through academic channels, from old friends who had seen her name mentioned. In early reports about the breakthrough, even from William, whose terse text simply read, "Congratulations, we should talk when you get home." But it was the email from the Able Foundation that left her breathless. They were expediting the review of her proof. If verified, they wanted her to come to Oslo in December for the formal announcement. Eleanor Mitchell, the woman who had been dismissed as just a housewife, had solved one of mathematics' most challenging problems. As she looked out at the Oxford skyline, she felt a profound sense of vindication, not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been underestimated, every person whose intellect had been dismissed based on appearances or circumstances. Tomorrow, she would return home to face William and whatever the future held for their marriage. But tonight, Eleanor savored her triumph, not with arrogance, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally reclaimed her voice. The housewife had become the mathematician once more, and the world of numbers that had been her first love welcomed her back with open arms. 6 months after her presentation at Oxford, Eleanor stood at the window of her new office at Cambridge University, watching students cross the historic courtyard below. The same courtyard she had walked through as a young woman, filled with dreams and ambitions that had been set aside but never truly forgotten. Life had transformed dramatically since that day at the conference. The Able Foundation had verified. Her solution to the Reichmann conjecture and the announcement in Oslo had made headlines around the world. Housewife solves famous mathematical problem was how many outlets initially framed it. But as the significance of her work became apparent, the headlines shifted. Eleanor Mitchell's revolutionary approach opens new fields of mathematical inquiry. The $1 million prize had given her financial independence for the first time in her adult life. Cambridge University had offered her a position as a visiting professor, which she had accepted with a sense of coming full circle. She was now developing her dimensional folding concept into applications beyond the Reichmann conjecture, with promising implications for quantum computing and artificial intelligence. Her relationship with William had not survived the upheaval. After 30 years of marriage, they had separated shortly after her return from the conference. It wasn't a bitter ending, just the quiet acknowledgement that they had become different people with different paths. William couldn't adjust to his wife's sudden fame or to the fundamental shift in their dynamic. The man who had loved her mind decades ago had forgotten how to make space for it in their shared life. "Professor Mitchell," a voice from the doorway interrupted her thoughts. One of her graduate students, a bright young woman from Seoul, stood with a stack of papers. "The department asked me to bring you the applications for the Eleanor Mitchell Scholarship Fund." Eleanor smiled, taking the papers. The scholarship was perhaps what she was most proud of, a fund specifically designed to support women returning to mathematics after career breaks, particularly those who had left the field to raise families. It was her way of ensuring that other women wouldn't have to choose between their intellectual passions and their personal lives, as her generation had so often been forced to do. Thank you, Jin. Would you like to stay for a cup of tea? I'd love to hear how your research is progressing. As they discussed Jin's work, Eleanor reflected on how much she enjoyed mentoring young mathematicians, encouraging them, challenging them, watching their confidence grow. She had discovered a talent for teaching that rivaled her skill for research, perhaps because she understood so well what it felt like to doubt oneself. Later that afternoon, Eleanor had a video call scheduled with her children. Their initial shock at the changes in their mother's life had given way to pride and support. Thomas had apologized for doubting her, admitting that he had never really understood who she was beyond her role as his mother. Rebecca had flown to Oslo for the Abel Prize ceremony, crying unabashedly as Eleanor received the award. Even little Sophie, now a successful architect, had begun calling her mother for advice on challenging projects, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "Mom," Sophie had said during their last call, "I never knew you were so brilliant. I knew you were smart, but I had no idea." The comment had made Eleanor reflect on how little her children had known about her life before they were born, about the young woman who had excelled at mathematics and dreamed of academic recognition. She had started sharing stories with them about her university days, her early passion for numbers, the papers she had published as an undergraduate. It was like introducing them to a mother they had never met. As the afternoon light began to fade, Eleanor prepared for her final appointment of the day, an interview with a science journalist working on a feature about women in mathematics. These interviews had become a regular part of her life, and while she sometimes found the attention overwhelming, she had come to see them as an opportunity to challenge stereotypes and encourage other women who might be hesitating to pursue their passions. The journalist, a thoughtful woman in her 30s, asked questions about Eleanor's mathematical approach, her experience at Oxford, and her current research. Then came the question Eleanor had heard countless times. "Do you have any regrets about the years you spent as a housewife instead of pursuing mathematics?" Eleanor considered her answer carefully, as she always did. "I don't think of those years as instead of pursuing mathematics," she replied. "They were years of pursuing different priorities, raising my children, supporting my family. The mind doesn't stop working simply because life takes a different turn. In many ways, my approach to the Reichmann conjecture was shaped by decades of thinking differently, of solving everyday problems that required creativity and persistence. The woman who solved that equation was not despite being a housewife for 30 years. She was in part because of it." The journalist nodded, clearly intrigued by this perspective. "And what would you say to other women who may have set aside and their professional dreams?" Eleanor smiled. "I would tell them that it's never too late to reclaim those dreams, that their minds are still powerful, their contributions still valuable. I would tell them that sometimes the very experiences that seem to have taken them away from their goals have actually given them unique insights that no one else has. And to the young women just starting their careers, I would tell them to never let anyone define their capabilities based on how they look or what roles they play in life. To remember that being a mother, a wife, a caregiver, these don't diminish your intellect. They simply add dimensions to it." After the interview, Eleanor walked home through the streets of Cambridge, enjoying the crisp evening air. Her small apartment near the university was nothing like the family home she had maintained for decades, but it was filled with books, papers, and the tools of her renewed mathematical life. It was, in every sense, her own space. On her desk lay an invitation to speak at the International Congress of Mathematicians next year, the most prestigious gathering in her field. Beside it was a more personal invitation, her granddaughter's science fair, where the 8-year-old would be presenting her first research project. Eleanor treasured both equally. As she prepared a simple dinner for herself, Eleanor remembered the woman she had been a year ago, hurriedly hiding papers when her husband came home, doubting her own abilities, afraid to claim space for her passion. That woman seemed like a stranger now, though Eleanor understood her choices and her fears. The Reichman conjecture had changed Eleanor's life, not just through the accolades and opportunities it had brought, but by forcing her to confront the question that so many women face. Was she willing to risk everything, her comfortable routines, her marriage, her very identity as others defined it, to be true to herself? The answer had been yes, though the journey had been more difficult and more rewarding than she could have imagined. Eleanor had discovered that reclaiming herself had ripple effects far beyond her own life. Her example had inspired other women to return to abandoned dreams, had challenged institutions to recognize unconventional paths to excellence, had even led to subtle shifts in how the academic world valued different kinds of intelligence and experience. As Eleanor sat down to eat, her phone pinged with a message. It was a photo from a former colleague of William's, showing a young woman receiving an award at a local high school. The caption read, "Thought you might like to know, they've renamed the Mathematics Prize after you. This young lady just won the Eleanor Mitchell Award for Mathematical Excellence. You're inspiring the next generation." Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. This, perhaps more than the Abel Prize or the Cambridge position, was what mattered most. That somewhere, a young girl might look at her story and think, if she could do it, so can I. The woman they had dismissed as just a housewife had changed the world of mathematics forever. Not because she had abandoned her role as a mother and wife, but because she had refused to let that role define the limits of her capabilities. Eleanor Mitchell had proven that brilliance doesn't disappear when it's temporarily set aside, that it's never too late to reclaim your passion, and that sometimes the person you least expect to change the world is precisely the one who does. What dream have you set aside? What passion burns within you that others have dismissed? Remember Eleanor Mitchell's story and ask yourself, what equation in your life is waiting for you to solve it? The world needs your unique perspective, your unconventional approach, your brilliance that has been shaped by every experience you've lived. Don't let anyone tell you it's too late. Don't let anyone define what you're capable of based on how they see you. In the end, it's not about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right. If Eleanor's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about a time when you or someone you know was underestimated. And remember, sometimes the greatest contributions come from those who were told they had nothing to contribute. Because the truth is, we all have a Reichman conjecture. In our lives, that challenge everyone says can't be solved, that dream everyone says is impossible, and sometimes all it takes to solve it is looking at it from a completely different angle, the angle that only your unique life experience can provide.